Our reading this morning is a familiar one. We've heard this story before. In fact, some of you probably remember a few years ago when this particular gospel story gave us the theme for a stewardship campaign. If you want to walk on water, what? If you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat. The passage calls us to step out in faith, to step out of our comfort zone and trust in God. And that's not always an easy thing for us to do. But as we'll see, we don't do it alone. Because the same God who calls is the God who empowers us to answer that call. The story begins immediately following the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus demonstrated his mastery over the physical universe by feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He sends the disciples on ahead across the Sea of Galilee in a small boat, while he takes some time alone in solitude for prayer. But the disciples are having a rough time of it. The wind is against them, the boat's being battered by the waves. They're understandably frightened. A small boat in those conditions is not a very pleasant place to be. And as morning approaches, they're even more frightened because they see a figure apparently walking toward them across the sea. At first, they don't recognize Jesus. All they know is that now, when they're already in danger, when they're already afraid, here is something else they don't understand coming at them. And their response is understandable. In the midst of the chaos and the wind and the waves, this new thing is just one more thing too many, and their response is fear. Jesus understands that, so he immediately moves to reassure them. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. But we're not real sure that the disciples are fully convinced of that, are we? At least Peter isn't. Because his response is, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, I can imagine Jesus kind of taking a pause at that point and looking at Peter and saying, really, Peter? I can imagine him doing that for 2 reasons, because Peter's answer has 2 parts to it. First, there's the part about, Lord, if it is you. I can imagine Jesus thinking, really, Peter, do you really not recognize me? Or do you really not believe that I can do this? You just watched me feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Do you really doubt that I can do this also? But I can also imagine Jesus pausing at the second part. Command me to come to you on the water. Really, Peter? Do you really think you're ready for this? But there's Peter, the beloved disciple, the simple fisherman with a heart as big as all outdoors, who loves Jesus beyond anything, looking at him expectantly and waiting for the command. So Jesus reaches out a hand to him and says simply, come. It's interesting that Peter asks for the command and waits for it before he acts. Because if we've read the other Bible stories of Peter, we know that he's the impulsive one. He's the one who's apt to rush into things. Peter leads with his heart, but not always with his head. He's apt to rush into things without having a full grasp of what it is that he's rushing into. He's the one that Jesus has had to correct several times. But on this occasion, even rash, impulsive Peter seems to understand that this is not something he could do on his own. This is something that he could only do in response to Jesus' command. So he waits until Jesus bids him come out onto the water. But when Peter steps out of the boat, he finds that God does meet him in the midst of that chaos. God does support him every step of the way. But then Peter loses his focus. After all, he's surrounded by all these terrifying things, the wind, the waves, all these voices of the universe telling him, you can't do this, it's impossible, you're going to sink. And sure enough, as soon as he stops paying attention to Jesus and starts paying attention to all of that, he does start to sink. And Jesus has to step in and rescue him. To the ancient Israelites, the sea represented everything terrifying and unknown. The land, their land that their God had given them, was where they felt that they knew what was what. That was where they met their God, first in their tabernacle as they were wandering in the desert, and then later in their promised land that their God had given to them in their temple. That was where they knew that they were secure. That was where they understood what was going on. The sea was wild, unknown, unknowable, full of terrifying things, seemingly almost beyond the power of God, certainly beyond their ability to understand it. From the book of Job, through the story of Jonah, even through verses in the book of Revelation, we see that. The sea is the wild, the unknown. But here is Jesus walking toward them on the sea, through the chaos, through the wind, through the waves, as calmly as though he were walking down the street. And he invites Peter to do the same. And Peter does, until he becomes frightened and loses his focus on Jesus. I think maybe we can all identify with Peter a little bit, can't we? How often do we hear what we think might be a call from God to do something, but we hesitate, we hold back? After all, it's a scary thing to step out where we think we could make a difference. We want to stay back because we're not sure we can do it. We stay in the boat rather than step out into the unknown where anything could happen. But that's just the point. Unless we're willing to step out where anything can happen, chances are nothing of any significance will happen. But if we're willing to step out in faith, we have the promise that God will meet us in the chaos, in the wind, in the whirlwind. Because the God who calls is the God who empowers. We see that time and time again in the scriptures, don't we? Down through the ages. God uses ordinary people who usually don't think they're up to the challenge to accomplish his purposes. From Abraham, who hears the call of God to leave his home and family and his lands and everything that he knows and follow this God into the middle of the wilderness. And he responds and he finds that God does meet him in the wilderness. We see it in Moses, who didn't want to go back to Egypt. He didn't want to be the one to go back and tell Pharaoh to let the people go. He made all kinds of excuses, including, I'm clumsy of speech. But God empowers him. God tells him, here's your brother Aaron. He'll speak for you. Isaiah, in his vision in the temple, doesn't want to be the one to carry the word of God to the people of Israel because he feels unworthy. In that vision, he tells God, I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. But in that vision, God cleanses his lips and sends him forth with a prophetic message. In the New Testament, we see Peter, this same disciple, learning to trust in God, because we see him before and after he learns to trust in God. Remember, Peter is the one who, on the night Jesus was arrested, denied him 3 times and then fled in terror from the questioning of a servant girl in the courtyard. And yet, not that much later, we see this same Peter, after the resurrection, after the Pentecost, standing in front of the Sanhedrin, the most powerful religious body in all of Israel, who have the power to sentence him to death, giving one of the most eloquent and powerful defenses and expositions of the Christian faith in all of Scripture. Peter had learned to trust in God. The Apostle Paul originally was a persecutor of the church, and I'm sure felt unworthy to be an apostle until he met Jesus on the road. He learned to trust in God and became the apostle to the Gentiles, the one to take the message of Christianity beyond Israel into all the known world at the time. Down through the ages, the message of Christianity has moved forward in just that way, through ordinary people like St. Augustine, Martin Luther, John Wesley, and so many others. Ordinary people empowered by God to do extraordinary things. I'm sure that we all know of a few people in our own lives who might fall into that category. people who have stepped out in faith and found that God would meet them in the chaos. And as we learn to trust in God, it becomes easier to step out in faith because we've gained experience with God meeting us along the way. One of the verses that came to mind when I was preparing this that I think explains this very clearly is from the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 4, verse 13, where he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, that is, through Christ who strengthens me. I was thinking of that verse as I was preparing this, and interestingly enough, I went to our men's group meeting that week only to hear Lenny Calangione tell the story of going into a job interview that he, early in his career, that he wasn't really confident about, but he went in with that verse in mind, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and found that God met him in the middle of that and brought him through that experience. I'm sure many of us can think of other people in our lives, in this congregation, who have stepped out in faith and found that God has met them. Many of you know Claire Bloom, know that she is the one who began the ministry known as End 68 Hours of Hunger. Claire learned that many school children were going hungry from noon on Friday when they got their last school lunch of the week till Monday morning when they got their first school-provided breakfast of the week. In that unmet need, Claire heard a call from God, and she stepped out in faith to answer it. I asked her if she had any trepidation, any hesitation about that, and she said absolutely none, because that was clearly a call from God to do something. And she had learned that she could trust that God would meet her there. And we have watched that ministry grow from its beginnings here in the seacoast area of New England through to the West Coast, to the Midwest, to Florida, all through the nation. That's exactly the way the message of Christianity moves forward, through ordinary people empowered by God to do extraordinary things. So, where does that leave us this morning? Are we perhaps hearing a call from God? Maybe in the form of an unmet need, maybe in the form of a cry for help, maybe simply in the form of somebody we know who could really use some compassion, companionship, some care. Are we willing to step out in faith and trust that God will empower us to meet that need? We stand there like Peter, wanting to get out of the boat, but not really sure that we can. Now, just like then, the storm rages all around. All those voices are around us telling us, you can't do that. It's impossible. You're going to sink. Now, just like then, Jesus stands before us and bids us to step out in faith and trust that he will meet us there. Now, just like then, Jesus stands before us, reaches out a hand, and says simply, come. What will our answer be? Amen.